So we're ready to talk about the cell cycle. Um, I guess a good place for us to start would be to take a look at this diagram. If you notice in the diagram, it's in the shape of a circle. Why is that important? Well, if you think about all the other cycles that we have on the planet, carbon cycle, water cycle, life cycle, all those other cycles, you know that there's actually no beginning and there's no end. And the same is true with the cell cycle. It just keeps going. Um, we're going to talk in detail about all these phases that you see currently looking at this diagram. We'll focus first on interphase, which is the cell's way of preparing for replication. And then we'll talk about mitosis itself, which is when the cell actually goes through the process of separating itself into two daughter cells. Before we do that, though, let's go back to one of the most basic theories that covers biology, and that's the cell theory. There's three main parts to the cell theory, and those three parts say what you see here on the screen. Cells are the most basic unit of life. Everything that's living is composed of one or more cells. And in order for you to have a new cell, they have to come from a pre existing cell somewhere. So, this is where replication and the cell going through mitosis fits into the cell theory. We can't have a new cell if it didn't come from an original cell in the first place. We talked a little bit about the difference between sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. Um, Keep in mind that sexual reproduction is what most people think of. You need a sperm cell and an egg cell in order to have offspring. That means half of the chromosomes or the genetic information is coming from one parent, and half of the genetic information comes from the other. But asexual reproduction is going to involve just typically one cell, and that cell is going to separate itself in some kind of way. Sometimes it's in the form of budding, which is when a piece of an organism breaks off and becomes, or a bud comes out, and that bud becomes a new organism. Fragmentation would be when an actual piece of the organism breaks off and then grows into a genetically identical organism. Mitosis, the process of it, is asexual reproduction because the cell just makes copies of the DNA. Those copies are separated into opposite or onto opposite ends, and then the cell splits literally in half and goes from one parent cell to two daughter cells that are genetically identical. This is why your skin cells pretty much all look the same. This is why your hair cells pretty much all look the same. Those cells are replicating through mitosis. When one cell dies, cells receive signals saying, oh no, we lost a cell. And they start their growth signals. And those growth signals say it's time for us to make some new cells. Just so you know, you do have some cells in the human body that do not replicate. Your brain cells, the brain cells that you have, once they die, they do not make new brain cells. So as you age, of course, normally you do lose brain cells. There's also other factors that can lead to brain cell loss, an injury to the head. Drugs and alcohol can also lead to brain cell damage and brain cell death. And there's several other situations, including some illnesses. Also, bone cells. Once your bones have finished completely growing, somewhere at the end of puberty, the bone cells that you have are the only bone cells that you're ever going to have. This is why people who have bone loss, that bone loss is not replaced. So that's a couple of examples of some of the cells, and we call those cells somatic cells, some of those body cells that don't replicate. Keep in mind that your germ cells or your gametes, they're going to perform meiosis, which is where there's going to be two sets of cell division in order to get your sex cells. Your somatic cells, they're the ones that perform mitosis, skin, hair, liver. blood, things like that. So let's go back and let's take a look at this chart again. Notice again, it's in a circle, it's a cycle, and the cycle goes in one direction. It starts with something called the G phase, moves into the S phase, and then a second G phase. Those G's stand for growth. The S stands for synthesis, meaning creating. In the two G phases, the cell is going to grow and prepare itself for division. In the S phase, that's when the new DNA is synthesized. We already talked about DNA and replication, and so you know how to code your DNA for copies. And that's going to happen during the S phase. The cell division part, which is mitosis, you'll notice it has some phases within it, and that's where the cell actually goes through the process of taking that copied DNA, moving it, and then splitting the cell into two. Um, Along the way with the cell cycle, there are several checkpoints. We'll talk into detail about those checkpoints so you understand why they occur and where they occur. The locations of those checkpoints are really important because if the cell doesn't check itself for any mistakes, then those mistakes can lead to bigger issues with the way the cell can function. A few reminders for you again, of course, the difference between your somatic cells and your gametes. And I'm going to repeat this frequently because we're going to start with mitosis. And then eventually, when we start talking about traits that you inherit, we'll get into meiosis and how our sex cells form. Your somatic cells are the cells that are going to use mitosis to reproduce. And if you really just stop and think, every day you're losing hair. Every day your nails are growing. Every day your skin cells are shedding. All of those cells, they're continuously reproducing. And they have to reproduce, otherwise, you wouldn't be around anymore. Think about all the skin cells you lose. If they didn't get replaced, then you wouldn't have any skin left. Um, the typical time that a cell goes through the entire um, cell cycle from the beginning of interphase all the way to finishing mitosis and going through cytokinesis takes about 24 hours. Um, Mitosis itself only takes up a small part of that. If the cell does not need to go through that preparation and replication process, then the cell will sit in what's called the G0 phase, which is a cell at rest. Some cells in your body will be at rest longer than others. Going back to your skin cells shed a lot. So your skin cells, they probably don't stay at rest for very long. You do have some other cells, though, in your body that they may actually stay at rest longer because those cells are not dying off as quickly. And we'll actually look into detail with that as we go through some of our lessons this week and talk specifically at some of the different cells in your body and when they replicate, how often they replicate, um, and how that process works specifically with those cells. You'll notice next in your lesson that you're going to have your own diagram that you're going to work with, and you have a few notes to take on a basic overview of the cell cycle. Tomorrow, we actually get detailed with interphase, and then you will do a lab simulation just with interphase. Then we'll talk about mitosis and what happens during actual cell division. And then we will do a simulation with mitosis also before we move into everything about cancer and how cancer fits into the cell cycle and how those checkpoints that we're going to learn about, how those checkpoints have a huge impact on whether cancer develops or not.